This is going to be the last of the readings from Writers Crossing Boundaries, Writing the Real World, published by Linus Publications, 2008. And tonight, it being the Sabbath, and then coming Saturday and Sunday, I thought it would be appropriate that I would read an essay that I wrote a couple of years after graduate school, and it's called Reading Scripture. And I based this particular reading upon the writings of Wolfgang Iser, The Act of Reading, A Theory of Ascetic Response, that was published back in 1978. So based on his theory, I wrote this essay about how I approach reading Scripture, particularly the Old Testament prophets. And I begin with a quote from Nehemiah, quote, "And they read from the book, from the law of God clearly, with interpretation, and so they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading." Nehemiah 8:8. Reading Scripture. In the attempt to process cognitively the density of prophetic literature, I want to combine my reading efforts with the equally dense theory of ascetic response by Wolfgang Iser. Iser disagrees with the traditional method of extracting the hidden meaning of a text, which he considers to be subtracted from a literary work as a function of interpretation. Iser rebuffs the idea that meaning is a buried secret, which reduces text to objects which contain simple referential meaning, for, as Iser notes, meaning cannot be reduced to a thing, such as a secret message or a hidden philosophy of life. It is for this reason that I sometimes embrace Iser as a guide to open further gates for my travels into prophecy. Iser explains that as the text and the reader collectively merge into one locality, the great division between subject and object is no longer applicable. Thus, meaning is no longer a definable object, but is an effect to be experienced. As a student of literature, I was trained to engage in a type of traditional textual analysis where the search for this hidden meaning ignored the reality of the author's intentional meaning and also overlooked any linguistic expectations that the language of the text might have proposed, which has been an obvious flaw in past biblical interpretations. Therefore, I was originally trained as an excavator of meaning rather than as an experiencer of the effect of meaning. The traditional interpretation of text, which Iser describes, comes from a time when literary texts were supposed to be representative of the spirit of their age, as well as representative of the age's social conditions, and indicative of the neuroses of the authors. Iser believes that new criticism called off the search for meaning and focused on the interaction of elements within a literary work which removed the text's ambiguities, a distinctly functional approach. Iser criticizes this approach in its attempts to define these functions through the same norms or interpretation that were used in uncovering representative meanings. That's an end of Iser quote. Iser prefers to construct a method of consistency building for the reader as a structure which guides the comprehension of the text. This structure places more emphasis on the reader of the text than on the text itself, a decidedly subjective approach and contrary to everything biblical interpreters have been previously taught. This method of consistency, together with the continued applications of classical norms of interpretations, help the reader to establish the consistency of available sections of the text, which make the unfamiliar accessible if not controllable. Easer believes that a reader's goal should not be about explaining a work, but should be about revealing the, quote, conditions that bring about its positive effects, end of quote. As a reader, I must then attempt to respond to the structure of this consistency, so that what I do not understand about the context of a piece of scripture can be controlled, as I proceed to build other aspects of the scriptural text to promote consistency in my comprehension, and as I understand how these consistencies bring me to a higher cognitive awareness of the scripture's fuller meaning. And then I'm not going to read the entire essay because you would be mightily bored, but I wanted to give you a sample of this kind of writing. Yes. Easer defines the ideal reader as someone possessing the identical cultural codes of the author, a notion Easer believes to be quite impossible, as ideal readers would have to grasp the potential meaning of a text outside the framework of their own historical situation. The historical qualities of a text may construct an image of an ideal reader, or help to imagine the intentions of the author, but they can never predict how the reader will respond to a particular text. As the text of Scripture was meant for all generations, I believe that, as a reader, I can ignore most of the historical situation of prophecy in order to grasp higher meanings. Instead of an ideal reader, Easer believes that the role of the reader is structured by the text's various perspectives, and by that point of convergence, where the reader is able to join these perspectives, forming an interaction of perspectives to guide them. Okay. Readers are sometimes frustrated by the multiple perspectives of scriptural text. The most complicated part of reading Scripture is the building of connections and consistencies. Frustration also occurs between a prophet's ancient repertoire and the personal repertoire a modern seeker reader brings to the text. One way of building biblical consistencies is to close the gaps in the meaning of scriptural text from which we plan to derive meaning. The gaps a reader of Scripture encounters are those places in the text where the reader pauses to make meaning, the place in the text where the reader lacks the information needed to cognitively process the text. When these gaps occur, the reader pauses to examine the prophet's intent and what the prophet means through his various phrases and metaphors. Our modern perspective of prophet's text naturally affects our construction of meaning. We possess acculturated perspectives, environmentally conditioned religious beliefs and private political biases and intentions, and economic circumstances. Often the themes we construct in response to Scripture reflect our private interests, so that we frequently find a theme or construct one in our own personal reaction to the reading. As I observe what the prophet has written, I will attempt to comprehend, according to Easer's plan, what the prophet meant by his words. This will be my first task, that of monitoring. That is, how will I build my response to the text? I will then attempt to elaborate on the prophet's text, produce my own meaning in order to enhance both the text of the prophecy and my own personal text, which I have produced as a response to the prophet's utterances. This stage involves my own repertoire of knowledge and my competence in operating my own cognitive processing abilities. At this phase, my prior knowledge and spiritual experiences combine with the biblical text to create new propositions, ideas, and critical perspectives. This is when I make the move from reading to writing. This is the origin and creation of my written response. And I'm going to end there. So I hope that you enjoyed the readings from Writers Crossing Boundaries. And I will be developing a series